grace and truth. We have been exploring this idea over the last couple weeks about what grace is and what truth is and how these two things can come together. And at the same time, it seems a little bit odd for us because grace and truth kind of seem on the opposite ends of the spectrum. And we've also been learning that we typically tend to lean towards one side or the other, grace or truth. Now, I know today is the start of the NFL season, but college football started a week ago, and I was curious to know if there are any Clemson football fans in here. I don't know if there are. I think there's a few, maybe, but you might want to turn your ears off for this for a second. But about a week ago, Clemson, mighty Clemson, ranked in the top 10, played a football game against lowly Duke. And Clemson was favored to win this game by quite a margin, but Duke played a really good game, and they ended up winning the game 28-7. They lost to this school that's known way more for their basketball program than they are for their football program. And so, of course, after a win like that, I mean, the student section rushes the field, and there's TV cameras all over trying to capture people's reactions. And so one of the TV cameras caught up with the Duke quarterback. His name was Riley Leonard. And somewhere in the middle of this interview, Riley remembers he has an assignment due at midnight that day. And so he starts making this plea to his professor, like, man, we just played this game, and I don't know, maybe you could show me a little bit of grace. Maybe, I don't know if you're seeing this or not. Well, it turns out that his professor did see this plea. And his professor decided to make a video of his own and respond. And so I thought it'd be kind of fun to check out this interaction of grace and truth between quarterback and professor.
Taylor, if you're seeing this, please let me turn in my homework late because it's due tonight.
Congratulations to you and all your teammates. But you know, Wesley Williams and the other linemen who were in the class, they said they prepared ahead and did it ahead of time, so why didn't the quarterback? So no way, man. No extension.
No way, man. No extension, right? I mean, sometimes we ask for grace and all we get is truth. Although I got to say, the professor was pretty gracious. Hey, you played a great game. You did a good job. But there's still some truth here, right? And isn't it true? I mean, as we watch that, we usually we lean towards one side or the other, right? We're either team grace or we're team truth. And whichever way we tend to lean, typically, we're pretty passionate about that. Like if you're on Team Grace, like you might feel like, man, the truth people, they're just so harsh. Like, let's just take a deep breath and realize everybody's not perfect, okay? And if you're Team Truth, well, sometimes the grace people just feel a little wishy-washy, don't they? I mean, Riley Leonard knew that the assignment was due and when it was due. And man, if the professor would have shown him grace, and yeah, you can have that extension, it really wouldn't have been that fair to his teammates who went the extra mile and got things done early, right? And so there's this tension. There's this tension of, well, should I be more graceful? Should I have more truth? And how do these things work together? But what if both can be true? That there is a place for a balance between both truth and grace. And if that's true, what are we supposed to do with that? How do we work with that? I remember when I was in the second grade, I got sent to the principal's office because I was out of my seat during a lunch period. It was like one of those weird days where it's like, hey, we're gonna eat lunch in the classroom, and the teacher did something in 1982 that you probably couldn't get away with today. So I'm gonna leave and go to the restroom and leave all you second graders by yourselves for a moment. And they would always say this, nobody get out of their seat, right? And so like I was a rule follower. I'm hungry, I wanna eat my lunch here. And all of a sudden, like as soon as she left, I mean, that one kid's like, nope, I'm gonna push the boundaries. And he got up, and he walked over to my desk, and he took my bag of chips. And I was like, what? What are you doing here, man? Like, now listen, when I was in second grade, like, there was only one thing I loved more than gym class. That's what you called it in 1982. It wasn't PE, it was gym class, right? There was only one thing I loved more, and that was lunch, right? I loved lunch. I was hungry. And so I said, I'm going to go get my chips back. I'll just go get them. I'll go back. No problem, right? Go over there, grab my chips. I'm on my way back to my seat. And who walks in? And who's out of their seat? this guy, right? And so I get sent to the office, and I know times have changed a little bit over the last 40 years, but when I was in second grade, like there was nothing worse that could happen than to get sent to the principal's office. Especially when you knew whatever punishment, your parents made it very clear, whatever punishment happens at school, if you get in trouble, you're getting double at home, right? I mean, there's some of you that remember those days, correct? Now, on top of that, my mom knew the principal personally. She knew the principal personally, Mr. Anderson, Lowell Anderson. I mean, can you think of a better name for an elementary school principal than Lowell Anderson? I mean, it just has justice written all over it. I just remember sitting there as a second grader, just waiting for the worst. Because when you get sent to the principal's office in your second grade, I mean, your life's just over. And waiting, that's the worst part of it. But I remember Mr. Anderson coming in, sitting down across that giant wood desk, and I'm just trembling. And hey, Mark, I don't see you in here too often. Tell me what happened. Well, they told us not to get out of our seat, but he came over to my chair and he took my chips, and I was hungry, so I just thought I'd go get my chips. And then she came in, and I was out of my seat, but he was out of his seat first. Was I wrong? I was. The teacher said not to be out of your seat. I could have waited, I suppose, until she got back in and said he came and took my chips and all that stuff. And Mr. Anderson reminded me as such. But he also saw that there was an extenuating circumstance that was happening there. And he let me go back to my class with just a warning to make sure that I'm listening to my teacher and following her rules, because what she said was for my safety. And I remember in that moment, or maybe not in that moment, but as I look back now, I look back and even though I can say, like, in that moment, Mr. Anderson showed me what Jesus was like. Because there was a balance of grace and truth in that moment. And I can look back now and go, maybe that situation was pretty minor compared to some of the other things that I've faced as I've gotten older in my adult life. But in that moment, Mr. Anderson showed me who Jesus was. And I remember that 40 years later. And all throughout Scripture, we see Jesus walk this delicate line of balancing grace and truth, and extending grace, but calling us to truth at the same time. And so we're going to jump right into our story today. We're going to be in John chapter 5. And so if you want to follow along, we're going to start right at the very beginning, starting in verse 1. And we're going to jump right into this story as Jesus shares with us another example of how he balances grace and truth. And so it starts this way. It says, sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm getting in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." And at once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and he walked. And the day on which this took place was a Sabbath. So I want to pause there for a moment. I want to talk about this part of the story for just a moment. There's a man here who's been paralyzed for 38 years. He's been laying next to this pool. We don't know how long, but it seems to imply he's been there for quite some time. But I think we need to ask this question, like, why were people laying by this pool? Why were there such a large number of blind and lame and paralyzed that were laying next here? What was it about this place? He said, when the waters are stirred, I don't have anybody to get me in. Like, what was that all about? So there was this stirring of the water. And there were some people then who tried to explain, like, what is happening? What is going on here? And so there was one belief that there was the waters were being stirred by a Greek god by the name of Asclepius. He was the god of medicine. And then there were others who go, well, we don't believe in the Greek god, so let's figure out, it must be something different. It's an angel of the Lord that comes down and he stirs the waters with his wings. Now today, archaeologists have done a lot of research and a lot of work, and they can look back and they look at these pools that were at Bethesda, and they can see that there was an intricate water system that King Herod had built, and all these waterways were connected in some way or other. And what they had found was when certain valves were open to fill up a different area, it would cause a stirring and a bubbling in this pool. But the people that were there at the time, they would have no idea of knowing what it was that was stirring. It's certainly not the poor, the people who were paralyzed, those who were blind. They would have no idea what that was. And so this legend became a reality to them, that when these waters are stirred, the first one to enter would be healed. Now, that sounds a little sketchy to us in 2023, right? If we hear a story like that, we're like, come on, really? But it's really not all that far off from things that we hear and read about today, right? We see on TV remedies for quick weight loss. If we're scrolling through social media, there are get quick rich schemes, those kind of things. We've all heard about a doctor who specializes in certain therapies, and all I have to do is fly halfway across the world and meet with this person. And I think most of the time when we hear about those types of things, it's met with a good amount of skepticism, and rightfully so. But I also think that in the back of our minds, we kind of are sitting there going, it sounds sketchy, but what if? What if it's true? I don't want to miss out. I mean, what if that Nigerian prince really does have $1 million that he wants to wire to my bank account? I don't know. Maybe I should try, right? Just to see. And so I think that's kind of where we find ourselves in this story with this man, right? Maybe he feels like he's run out of options. And so I know this feels out there. I know this feels like it's far-fetched, but what if it's true? What if it's true? And so Jesus comes to this man in this condition, and he says, do you want to get well? And it seems like such an odd question to ask. Somebody who's been paralyzed and been in this condition for so long. But maybe now that we know a little bit more of the backstory of the bubbling of the water in the pool, and maybe we know a little bit more about his story, maybe it makes more sense that Jesus would ask this paralyzed man if he wanted to be healed. And I think it's important for us to understand at the same time that Jesus was not asking this question. He was not asking it in a condemning way. He wasn't asking it in a sarcastic way. He was very much asking it in a grace-filled way. You've been paralyzed for 38 years. You've been laying next to this pool for a really long time. And I know you've had your hopes up and you have them crushed time and time again. But I think you know this pool and this water that bubbles, it has nothing to offer you. But maybe this man had to hold on to some kind of hope. And maybe we know that feeling all too well at the same time, that maybe there are things going on in our lives where we feel like we are barely hanging on. And if I don't have something to put my hope in, I don't know if I can make it another day. And so Jesus walks up to this man full of grace and he says, do you want to be well? And then when the man answers, he does some of the things that we do at the same time. He avoids the question, makes all kinds of excuses. There's no one to help me. I've tried everything. What else am I supposed to do? But that's not the question that Jesus asked him. Jesus didn't ask him, why aren't you well? He said, do you want to be well? No more excuses. No more finger pointing. Do you want to be well? Pick up your mat and walk. And then the man is given this gift. He gets up, he walks. He's given this gift that he did nothing to deserve. And that's what grace is. When we receive something that we have done nothing to deserve. And what a miracle it must have been for those around to see what was happening in that moment. But not everybody shares in his excitement. Not everybody sees the grace that is happening in this story. There are some religious leaders, and they kind of see what's happening, and they're not too happy, and they're ready to drop some truth. And so we're going to pick up in the story in verse 10, if you want to keep on following along. And so remember, as we ended there, this thing that Jesus did happened on the Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, it's the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat. But he replied, the man who made me well said to me, pick up your mat and walk. I've been paralyzed for 38 years. I haven't walked for 38 years. Somebody told me I can get up and walk. I really don't care what day it is. I'm going. So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. What a response to seeing somebody healed that hasn't walked for 38 years, right? I mean, this man has been paralyzed for this amount of time. And I think we can tell from the story that the religious leaders, they either saw the miracle happen or they at least know the man. They've at least seen him around. And in either scenario, they miss it. They miss the moment. They miss this extraordinary thing that Jesus has just done. Why? Because all they can see is truth. Now, we need to pause for a moment because I do think that it's easy for us to look back on a story like this that happened 2,000 years ago and be like, well, how blind do they have to be? That just seems crazy. This man hasn't been able to walk for that amount of time, and now he's walking, and their main concern is that it happened on the Sabbath? Wow, that seems so crazy to us. But we have to understand that in their world, for Jews and especially for religious leaders, the highest form of love was to be obedient to God's law. 613 laws. 613 laws, and that's how the Jewish people showed God that they loved him, by keeping those laws to the very best of their ability. And so were they wrong in what they said to the man? No, they weren't. They weren't wrong. The religious leaders were telling the truth. The law forbids you to carry your mat on the Sabbath. God created the Sabbath. He created it as a day of rest. And so to do any kind of work, to do any kind of labor, including something so seemingly as small as picking up your mat and walking down the street, well, in their eyes, you might as well be spitting in the face of God. But here's where the Pharisees missed it. They were all truth and no grace. They could not see past the law. In general, the law, 613 of them, was to be held higher than anything else. But that's not what Jesus was about. That's not what he was about. Did Jesus honor the law that God had been given? Absolutely he did. Absolutely he did. Even in Matthew, Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. But the law was never meant to be a weight on our shoulders. It was never meant to be that kind of a thing that weighs us down. It was meant to help set us free. See, I think most of us in here, even if you have little to no church background, you probably grew up and knew or at least heard about the 10 Commandments, right? I mean, we grew up learning about the 10 Commandments. Now, don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, like all of those things, right? And maybe we knew what these were. We may have even memorized them at one point in time. But maybe we didn't really fully understand them all that much. Because when we look at this list, it looks like a list of do's and don'ts. Do this, don't do that. Make sure you do this, but don't do that, right? But that wasn't what the 10 Commandments were. It wasn't a list. It wasn't a list of just a list of do's and don'ts. It was a way for people to love God and to love others. And so take a look at the first 4 commandments. They're there to remind us to love God. They're a way for us to love God, right? To not have any idols, to have no other gods before me. This is a way for you, the people, to love the Lord your God. And then look at the second set. They're there to help us love others, right? Why should I not lie? Why should I not steal? Because it dishonors those around us. It's why when Jesus was cornered by some Pharisees, in Matthew chapter 22. And they basically said to him, Jesus, all these laws, like, what do you say? What do you say is the most important? 613, what's the most important? And Jesus answered in the only way that Jesus can. And he said this, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And if Jesus would have stopped right there, the Pharisees could have said nothing more about it. But he doesn't stop there. Because he wants them to know, and he wants us to know, that there is more to it. And so he continues on. And he says, the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. That's why when I was in high school and I was learning about World War II and the Holocaust and those kind of things, and I had grown up, like the Ten Commandments was a list of do's and don'ts, and we would learn about people like Oskar Schindler, who was rescuing Jewish people, saving hundreds, maybe thousands of lives from Nazi persecution. But in order to do that, when a Nazi soldier would knock on the door, he would have to lie to them. And in my mind, I remember this battle going back and forth, like, well, he's helping people, but he's lying. He's breaking one of the 10 Commandments. And I think Jesus comes along and he says, no, you got it all backwards. You got it all backwards. Love reframes how we understand the law. Love reframes it. And we don't have time today, but I would invite you to go back maybe later on this afternoon or later on this week and go back and read Matthew chapters 5 through 7 and see how Jesus reframes the law through the lens of love. You'll see a lot of words that say like, hey, you've heard it said, but I tell you it's this way. I know you always thought it was this, but it's actually something different. And he reframes the law through the lens of love. All the law hangs on these two things, loving God and loving others. And the law is there to help us love each of those better. Does truth have a place? It absolutely does. It absolutely does. But Jesus is telling us, and he's telling the religious leaders, if your idea of truth is keeping you from healing others, if it's keeping you from loving and serving and helping those in need, then there's something wrong with your interpretation. And those wrong assumptions often lead to a divide among us, even in this day and age. And Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Why? Well, there's so many reasons, but as it pertains to what we're discussing today, grace should be something that we are learning to freely give. Because we all want grace in our lives when we mess up. We all want grace in our lives when things go wrong. We hope that someone will show us and extend grace to us. But when someone wrongs us, when someone does something to someone close to us, extending grace, that's a whole lot harder. However, Jesus shows us the way. He leads by example. Does that mean that Jesus was light on truth? Does that mean that Jesus didn't confront sin? Not at all. We see it over and over again in the gospel stories when Jesus has interactions with people. And we see it in this story as well with our friend who has just been healed at the pool of Bethesda. See, after this man was confronted by the religious leaders, Jesus finds him one more time. And so we find here, starting in verse 14, later Jesus found him at the temple and he said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." And the man went away and he was irritated. I can't believe he just called me out like that. How dare he? No, that's not what it says. It says the man went away and he told the Jews, he told the religious leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. Jesus knew that this man had sin in his life. And does that mean that this man was a bad person? Not necessarily. Right? There are many good people who are dealing with sin in their lives, and it keeps them and keeps us from living the abundant life that Jesus came so that we all could have. Jesus knew that the life that this man was living was robbing him of true joy and peace in his life. But before he ever confronts the man's sin, he shows this man who was probably went through something way more than what any of us really could imagine. He shows and extends love and grace, and it makes all the difference in this man's life. After and only after he's met this man's greatest need, he graciously reveals truth. You have sin in your life, and if you keep living this way, it's going to end poorly. Even though you can walk now and it feels like you have a second chance at life, sin will rob you of the things that are truly important. The life you lived as a paralytic for 38 years will be nothing compared to the havoc that sin will bring to your life. You've had an encounter with the Son of God. Now go and live like it. Had Jesus just left this man and not confronted the sin and called him to something better, he would have only been scratching the surface level. Do you want to get well? What a question to ask somebody who couldn't walk for 38 years. Of course I want to get well. Of course I want to I've tried everything. No, Jesus says. Do you want to get well? The question that Jesus is asking goes far deeper than the man's physical condition. Do you want to have the love and the joy and the peace and the patience in your life? Do you want to have kindness and goodness in your heart? Do you want to live your life with gentleness and faithfulness and self-control? Do you want to get well? And I think Jesus asks us the same question even today. Many of us come to God and we ask for things that will get us out of a difficult situation. Some of us are going through some heavy family things in our lives. Some of us are dealing with serious health issues, or we have a family member that's dealing with serious health issues. And we seek him in our time of greatest trouble, and we should. He welcomes us running into his arms. But the question still remains, do you want to get well? Maybe the things that we ask for might be a temporary fix. It might relieve some stress or alleviate some pain. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But do you want to get well? Do you want more than just a temporary fix? And if the answer is yes, Jesus calls us to something more. To leave a life of sin, to leave a life that is first and foremost about me and what I can get and all those things, so that I can have the life, I can exchange that life and have the life that Jesus calls and that he offers us to the fullest. See, we live in a world that makes sin look normal and righteousness seem strange. And Jesus says, do you want to have real life? Do you want to have real life? Do you want to get well? Then leave that life of sin. Even when everyone else is doing it, even when it looks right and normal compared to what the world's standards are. But why is that so hard for us? We talk about it, right? We've thought about it, and we know deep down inside that it would be in our best interest, but for some reason, it's just so hard to let go. It's so hard to walk away. And maybe it's fear that keeps us from leaving. It's fear of change. It's fear of the unknown. It's fear of missing out, maybe. Maybe it's shame that keeps us from walking away from that life. Like, I don't want anybody to know that I have this sin in my life, and so I'm just going to keep pretending that everything is okay, and meanwhile, it is killing us and eating us up inside. It might be addictions. It might just be a sense of self-control that I can control this thing. Whatever it is, Jesus calls us to truth, to leave a life of sin. And he does not do so to condemn us. He does so full of grace because he wants something far greater for us. And so maybe it's time. Maybe it's time to stop making excuses like the man at the pool did. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for somebody else to make the first move. Maybe you've been sitting and waiting for far too long, and Jesus says it's time to leave that world behind. It's time to get up and walk and live the life that I have called you to, a life that is full and free. You've heard us talk about the chosen often around here. And if you haven't started watching that, we highly encourage you to check that out. It just does such a great job of depicting the life of Jesus in a real way. And so as we close this morning, I want to invite you to watch the clip of the story that we just read about that brings it to life so well. And then you'll have a chance to respond as he asks us today, do you want to get well?
Shalom.
Me?
Yes.
Shalom.
I have a question for you.
For me. I don't have many answers, but I'm listening.
Do you want to be healed?
Who are you?
We'll get to that later. But my question remains.
Will you take me to the water? Look, I'm having a really bad day.
You've been having a bad day for a long time. So?
Sir, I have no one to help me into the water when it's stirred up. And when I do get close, the others step down in front of me. And so,
Look at me. Look at me. That's not what I asked. I'm not asking you about who's helping you, or who's not helping, or who's getting in your way. I'm asking about you.
I've tried.
For a long time, I know. And you don't want false hope again, I understand. But this pool, it has nothing for you. It means nothing. And you know it. But you're still here. Why?
I don't know.
You don't need this pool. You only need me. So, do you want to be healed? So let's go. Get up, pick up your mat, and walk.
I'm free to walk, like he said. Don't forget your bed.
Why does this matter?
Because you're not coming back here. That life is over. Everything changes now.
Thank you so much for joining us online today. If you heard something and would like to take a next step in your faith, I encourage you to text GP Next Step to 97000. We're so grateful you joined us today, and we hope to see you again next week.